Oh, Avatar, look at what they've done to you. I mean, I certainly won't look because I've already seen this story before, and I don't need to see it again in live action, which is more or less the point of this video, and if I can help it, I'm gonna try to get through it quick, because I gotta pump this out before the show premieres. Truly, this is a tale as old as time by now, or at least as old as like 5 or 7 years or something. I don't know, I'm not keeping track. Some goobers at a streaming service make a haphazard live-action adaptation of a beloved animated series or video game, then go full Maverick on the press tour and get everybody in a hate-watch frenzy because they know the show is actually just painfully mid, but season renewal relies almost exclusively on raw viewership within 2 days of the premiere. And so again, we've come to it with Netflix and with Avatar, and the quotes are pretty funny, if not generally damning. Here's the full list I can find as of writing, not only for your amusement, but so I can organize the issues that face all of these adaptations and address them for posterity. Sokka won't be sexist anymore because it's problematic, Katara won't deal with sexism in her arc because same, I guess, no more detours because serialized drama, no more Sozin's Comet because live-action actors age between seasons, on-screen genocide of the air nomads because the writers apparently just wanted to see it, and everyone's favorite, the show will be more like Game of Thrones, which is honestly a bad faith headline, but we'll get to it because, and this is gonna shock you, the original show was for kids, and we're big boys who write big important shows about important things. Now, there's one thing I want to make clear before I get into this. I'd bet my life savings that the creative voices who took over after the original Avatar guys left didn't want to write an Avatar show at all. That the core problem here is actually every studio's primal fear of risking even a red-hot fucking cent on a singular original idea in the IP-driven, universe-building, analytics-obsessed entertainment swamp we are collectively wading through. That said, and the creative minds here marginally absolved of fault, let's talk about why this was a stupid idea in the first place. At the end of the day, the primary issue consistently facing live-action adaptations of animated products is that nobody respects animation. This is a structural issue in the entertainment industry. Live-action writing is covered by the WGA, while most animation, with the exception of high-concept adult animation like The Simpsons, is covered by the Animation Guild. What this creates is a fundamental divide, and thanks to the significant pay difference between WGA and TAG minimums, an imagined hierarchy in the television writing world. There is, from the ground up, a strict precedent set that cartoons are lesser, and it shows. Netflix Avatar was supposed to feature the original's creators as EPs and showrunners. They quit in 2020 after what they described as a terrible working environment under Netflix's thumb, an admittedly extremely common sentiment among former Netflix show creators. Netflix then officially tapped successful writer and producer Albert Kim to take over, a full year after the original pair left. After the announcement, Kim let loose a blog post about why he took the job, recalling how he was sucked into the original after watching with his daughter, which is in fact the goal of most family television. He even admitted he wondered why bother remaking it, what there could be left to say that the show didn't say in its first effort. Somewhere over the course of the next few paragraphs, and most certainly over the next 2.5 years, he pretty significantly changed his tune. Completely faithful adaptations are undeniably impossible, and we'll get into that, not to mention the fact that they're fundamentally pointless. And it's easy to assume that changes being made are small and ineffectual. Does it really matter to Sokka's character development if he doesn't waste the first season being chauvinistic all the time? Well, technically, yes. It's being embarrassed by the Kyoshi warriors that sparks his interest in both military tactics and weapons expertise, as well as kickstarting the most organic romantic relationship in the show, which is a painfully rare thing in children's media. But that's all beside the point because they won't be going on any tangents anymore anyway. Ultimately, the foundations of Kim's logic are less absurd than they look out of context, but they are still minor changes to major thematic through-lines, which balance out to be a big-ass deal. Animation has a naturally higher suspension of disbelief, which is why it gets away with things like characters being obnoxious, tonal shifts and detours, and above all else, a believable set of child protagonists. There's a reason animated things are animated, and willfully ignoring that reason is the downfall of basically every live-action remake aside from the photoreal Disney ones that were just too big to fail no matter what. Like I said, I'd bet hard cash Kim would rather be making one of any, presumably numerous original ideas bouncing around in his head. But for a guy who claims every chance he gets to be a fan of the original animated series, it doesn't sound like he has any faith in it to resonate with the average viewer. It sounds like he sees it as theoretically incomplete, or just inherently lesser. I'm not saying I don't believe Kim liked Avatar. What I'm saying is I don't believe he ever fundamentally saw it as a TV show hard stop, but more specifically as a cartoon. It's the impossible hurdle for animation as a medium. It's a but, it's a caveat, it's an asterisk. It's the media equivalent of, boy, you sure throw well for a girl. I mean, it's not quite as fucked up, but it is a similar sociological phenomenon. We see this pattern with the vast majority of these disaster press tours. This idea that because the source material was born of a less than mainstream medium, it must not have been good enough to sell to normal people. It happened on Cowboy Bebop, it happened on Halo, and now it's happening on Avatar. We'll get to the specific line of thinking on some of these changes later, but the rotten core of the tree that every root comes back to is that live action is considered more important and more serious. There's no other point to remaking an animated show in live action. It's solely to attract viewers who would never watch a cartoon. Nickelodeon Avatar was for kids. Netflix Avatar is for mature grown-ups. Grown-ups who get pissy if a main character says something sexist. Okay, here's the one where we come dangerously close to defending what I cannot stress enough is a fundamentally stupid idea. We are going to defend Kim here because all in all he seems like a decent guy, and he does have a show to make one way or another. Ready? Here we go. Avatar Aang is a fucking child, and that's a big problem. The logistical concerns of adapting an animated series, especially one set in an aggressively fantasy world featuring child protagonists, are both numerous and fickle. As I mentioned, the suspension of disbelief is intrinsically higher in the animated medium. The same reverse masking effect that makes it funny and not horrifying when Homer Simpson treats his children like shit is what helps us take it seriously when a 12-year-old commands city-destroying magic. The casting decision made for the live-action Avatar show was to stick with age-appropriate actors. On the one hand, this is high risk because 12-year-olds usually aren't good actors. On the other hand, this is high risk because with all due respect to the effort these kids probably put in, they look kind of ridiculous. One of the things that makes Avatar work so well, especially for full families watching, is that while child viewers are reminded often enough that the characters are all between 12 and 16 years old, adult viewers don't usually feel like they're watching kids. It's a delicate balance that absolutely does not translate when you're actually looking at obvious children, but the hands of the producers are kind of tied from the start because, unlike animated characters, real kids age. This is where we get to the removal of both Sozin's Comet and, to a lesser extent but still, the general de-shenaniganizing of the story. Netflix Avatar will be an hour-long drama with 8-episode seasons. You get somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of true runtime to get through a functional season arc. And then this whole cast is at bare minimum a year older. Most boys grow like 3 inches between 12 and 13. You simply can't put a ticking clock in this version of the story. They have to do a time jump because with streaming, who even knows how long it'll take to get a season 2? So that's Sozin's Comet out the window. It was probably the first thing to go. But when you start to break down the necessary structure of an hour-long drama, the number of plot beats you need to hit per episode, only 8 episodes per season, suddenly you're forced to drop the shenanigans, not because it's a super serious drama, but simply because that's a lot of locations, action sequences, characters, and sheer story to pinball through on such a tight schedule. That's wildly expensive, and without the necessary suspension of disbelief, it creates tonal whiplash. Which, speaking of disbelief and of money, brings us to the other, let's say, family of logistics issues facing an adaptation like this. In the 2021 blog post where Kim explained why he took the showrunner job, one of the primary interests he offers in making a live-action Avatar was the advancement of visual effects and the prospect of properly expressing the magic of bending in live action, claiming, "We'll be able to see bending in a real and visceral way we've never seen before." Now, usually this kind of sentiment, this kind of quote, especially the word visceral, it's just a Trojan horse for violence specifically, which might explain why they want to show the air nomad genocide instead of, creating an empathetic response by forcing us into Aang's perspective during the most traumatic moment of his life. Anyway, whatever the case, this idea is always a huge problem, because frankly, it's wrong. Animation is intrinsically more stylized than live action. The ability to create impact through frame rate, create visual dissonance through mediums, not to mention color, visual noise, stacking animation styles, things being done today by most anime and Sony and DreamWorks, not to mention the planning. Bending is, mechanically speaking, just telekinesis with extra steps. Most of those extra steps specifically being vaguely interpretive martial arts. VFX artists are already underpaid and overworked, especially in television, and in this medium have to additionally work based off of whatever the actors are miming. The first live-action Avatar movie wasn't bad because the VFX were bad. The VFX were bad because the actors were poorly directed. The script was also bad, but right now we're talking about visuals. This is a problem that gets run into even on otherwise competently adapted stories about fantastical subjects. It's been 20 years, and every single live-action imagining of super speed still looks like shit. Impossible things are obviously hard to present realistically. Airbending is just gonna look like the Force, right? You can't see air. And water sims are globby, something about flamethrowers, so on and so forth. There's honestly not a lot that can be done about these problems. Logistics are the main reason animated stories shouldn't be adapted into live action. Rarely, if ever, can these specific hurdles be overcome, especially for a story that wants to take itself seriously, especially one that wants to take itself significantly more seriously than the source material. Which begs the last question, the last issue, the last block of this already too long and ranty video. Who the fuck is this really for? Let's talk about that buzz line where this is supposed to be like Game of Thrones. No, it's not. That was, I will be the first to admit, a bad faith headline for outrage clicks. Here's verbatim what Kim actually said as part of a response to a general question about the difference in tone necessary for live action. We had to make it a serialized Netflix drama, which meant it couldn't just be for kids. It had to also appeal to people who are big fans of Game of Thrones, and so it had to feel grounded and mature and adult in that way, too. Ignoring the fact that Kim himself once said the original did appeal to him as an adult, this is ultimately both a bit of a fair point and also sort of the whole big fucking problem. It's usually a studio problem, an extremely common one we call imagined demographic. The paradoxical desire to attract a quote-unquote mainstream audience to an idea perceived as niche by sanitizing it of its unique qualities and replacing them with a random assortment of popular tropes. This is straight up having your cake and eating it too, and it's never worked even once. Netflix seems to believe it can take a beloved property with a cult following and make quote-unquote normal people like it by just turning it into a generic hero's journey. Because it worked so well with Cowboy Bebop, and The Witcher, and Sweet Tooth, and Resident Evil, and I could keep going for 20 minutes, but those are just Netflix shows. The question of how faithful to be in an adaptation is not just a question of logistics, it's not just a question of respect for the original, it's a question of marketing. If you're too faithful, fans of the original may be satisfied, but why would they actually watch? Why would anyone watch? It's the same thing, just watch the original. If you're not faithful enough, you get a mess not unlike this one. Fans of the original yelling about all the dumb changes, a sour taste in the mouths of any potential new viewers because all you're getting is bad press around what is ultimately a show they heard was great but were either too lazy to get to or just too stubborn to watch a cartoon. There's no happy middle ground for this because if you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, calling it a reimagining or a remix or whatever, then nobody cares. You have no identity as a story, no real reason to exist. You're just bland content designed to pander as best as you can to two separate ideals and obviously cocking up both. Avatar is costing Netflix $15 million per episode. That's not try something out and hope it works money. That's we need a pretty big hit or we're kind of boned money. And I can't help but think this show is like so many of its predecessors. just gonna fall by the wayside. There are successful adaptations of animation in video games. The Last of Us did huge numbers. One Piece is literally a Netflix show, but those are adaptations that fully understood the appeal of their sources. The Last of Us is basically a movie already, so they kept it cheap and played it extremely straight for people who refused to play a video game, which was a bigger gate for general audiences than watching an animated show. One Piece went the other way, leaning so hard into its own goofiness that it shed the logistical concern of suspension of disbelief and came out the other side surprisingly fun and charming. I don't want to be a curmudgeon who wants live-action adaptations of animation to fail. I will never watch them, but I'm not rooting against them in principle. It keeps people employed, and sometimes, just sometimes, it encourages the mythical normal person new viewer to go and check out the original. But Avatar? You better believe I'm rooting against Avatar, because I don't want to see this particular mistake made again. If this lesson can be learned, the difference between a pointless reimagining and a thoughtful adaptation wary of and prepared for these three problems, then I'm all for it. But I know it needs to be learned the hard way, and preferably sooner rather than later.